Good afternoon, all. Welcome to the latest in our series of IOSH Railway Committee webinars. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tony Davey and I'm the current chair of the IOSH Railway Community Committee. I find it quite strange that we've scheduled to have this webinar about stranded train events so close to the incident that happened over the weekend at Ladbroke Junction with the Thameslink train. So I'm glad that we have invited Clare McClane, who is currently the Deputy Director of Train Service Delivery at GTS Rail. And Clare's going to take us through some of the lessons and learnings from the Ladbroke Grove derailment, which happened in December 2023. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. Don't forget to record your attendance in the webinar as part of your CPD and IOSH blueprint tool. And if you have any questions, please can you use the question and answer section of Zoom to place your questions in there. And then after Clare's finished with her presentation, we will review the questions and have some informal discussion about Clare's presentation. So over to you, Clare.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. So I thought it would be quite fitting to link this presentation into the 200-year anniversary of the railway. So I've entitled this From Industrial Might to Human Rights, and why customer experience during disruption must now be the focus of the railway moving forward. So next slide, please. I have already been introduced by Tony, but just to confirm, I am Clare McClane, Deputy Director of Train Service Delivery for the Elizabeth Line. I've been on the railway for 14 years, worked my way through Network Rail and Freightliner, and have been at the Elizabeth Line for 4.5 years. So if we can have the next slide, please. So 200 years of rail and how the risk of delay has grown with society. So 200 years ago, a stranded train may have meant a delay for a handful of early industrial travellers, typically merchants, landowners, or the privileged few whose day may have been inconvenienced, but rarely not as impacted as what we saw on Saturday at Loughborough Junction, as Tony mentioned. So there were no mobile phones, no live updates, very few passengers. But 100 years ago, as the railways expanded and Britain's working population became increasingly mobile, a stranded train would impact more people, but the consequences were limited. So maybe a misconnection, perhaps a letter of complaint. But again, not drenching social media with videos and commentary. But 50 years ago, the rail was backbone of commuting. So a stranded train could mean a worker's pay docked, a nurse missing a shift, or freight missing its market. But the services were less complex, passenger volumes were lower, and life was arguably slower. But today, a stranded train event can disrupt hundreds of thousands of lives instantly. So 39% of the UK's workforce have dependent children. 14% of the UK workforce have caring responsibilities for elderly relatives. And 10% of that workforce travel to work by train. So the working parent who misses school pickup, the student who loses exam access, the key worker delayed on shift, social media lights up instantly. There are 10 to 12 major global social media platforms used in the UK. Having this out there erodes trust in real time. Modern expectations, passenger vulnerability, and digital dependence mean that stranded trains increasingly escalate into uncontrolled evacuations. And not necessarily because passengers are in danger, but because even low-level delay is no longer tolerable for our society. Next slide, please. So why am I here? On the 7th of December 2023, we suffered significant disruption on the Elizabeth line when a GWR service heading out of Paddington Station damaged overhead line electric cables in the Ladbroke Grove area, which severely impacted all services between Paddington and Reading. We had multiple trains stranded. You can see on the slide that there were 4 MTR, back then Elizabeth line services, 2 Heathrow Express, and 1 Great Western Railway. And in all, over 3,000 passengers were stranded when the overhead wires collapsed ahead of the Paddington to Cardiff service. And this led to the overhead line power being isolated for 24 miles between Paddington and Maidenhead. It was dark, it was cold, and the video that we're just about to play will hopefully immerse you into what people felt on that night.
That's crazy.
That's so crazy.
That's crazy.
Oh my days. I never ever had this.
I never had this as well. That's crazy. I have a baby. I have a flight to catch.
So hopefully that will have given you a good understanding of what happened on that night. You could hear in the video that people were making reference to babies being on the train, people that required medication, people that were desperate to get home, people whose phones were running out of battery. They couldn't make contact with their employers or their families. It was a really, really difficult night. And on that basis, the Thames Valley operators' response to the incident linked very much into the requirement for an independent report. So there was an agreement between the operators and Network Rail that an independent report was commissioned. So this was undertaken by Chris Green and Keith Winder, both of whom are well renowned across the industry and very experienced senior leaders. 2 cross-industry work streams were created, one for operations and one for the customer experience. And each work stream held several workshops with senior representation from each Thames Valley operator. And out of that, we came up with a new ops plan for stranded trains, and a customer experience plan was developed and implemented. Next slide, please. So the independent report recommendations focus considerably on the customer experience, but for the purposes of this presentation, picked out the recommendations relating to accelerating evacuations to prevent the risk of self-evacuation. So when it comes to a stranded train event, the worst thing that can happen is for an unauthorized, uncontrolled evacuation of people on that train or on those trains onto the live operating railway environment. So we agreed that we would establish a joint stranded train strategy to prioritise the urgent rescue of stranded passengers, particularly those on electric trains, because it was the lack of power that caused the incident to snowball out of control. When you've got power, you've got more options to be able to move trains forwards and backwards into station locations where you can safely evacuate people. We looked at minimising electric isolation sections early in incidents to enable electric trains to operate under their own power. Agree that we prioritise passengers over assets during an incident. So that involves all operators and Network Rail considering who they have got in terms of resources And instead of sending perhaps the overhead line team to fix the overhead line equipment, which is usually going to take a long time, that they will prioritise supporting safe evacuations first. We looked at accelerating the 60-minute contingency plan for evacuations to make sure that actually we could have evacuations take place much sooner. Identify additional trained resources, including train crew or off-duty emergency services who may be on those trains to enhance the passenger rescue. Introduce additional training for the train operations liaison officer and other rescue staff. Implement processes for low-risk driver-only evacuations. And the rulebook does allow us to do that, but it's about encouraging and empowering decisions to take a driver-only evacuation. Developing a joint customer experience plan, refreshing volunteer customer support, and enabling control rooms to communicate directly with trains for rapid information sharing. Next slide, please. So we split this work stream into systems, processes and collateral, and people. So in terms of systems, we worked with a company called CPC to further enhance our crew displacement management tool. And this was developed to include a stranded trains module. So within that module, we were able to take live information from our 345 fleet, our fleet of Elizabeth line trains. And from those trains, we could populate this software platform with the exact location of the train using GPS and what 3 words, the status of equipment on the train, so whether or not the air conditioning or the heating and lighting was working. We could know exactly how many people were on those trains, and we could work out where our nearest access point was, or access points, and that would help us formulate a digital stranded trains risk assessment, which we could share with our industry partners. And this was a consistent and robust way of ensuring that we had shared situational awareness and could prioritise the right trains with the right response. Now, you may think that all trains should or could be prioritised the same. Well, on that night, it was very clear that the Elizabeth line trains that are driver only operated, that can hold up to 1,500 customers and that have no access to toilets, food or drink, needed to be prioritised. But that didn't happen. So we have built this now into a pre-agreed risk assessment that when there is a multiple stranded train event, that those types of considerations, so around what's available for the customers on those trains, is taken into consideration. In terms of processes and collateral, we carried out an extensive piece of work where we RAG rated and published a catalogue of access points along the Network Rail Western and the Rail for London infrastructure access points. So traditionally, you would know where your access points were, but from a customer perspective, they hadn't been assessed for availability of onboard travel, availability of shops, leisure facilities, shelter, medical assistance, ease of access from an access point. So some can be ramps, some are steps, some are a lot steeper than others. So we now have this information at the touch of a button linked into our stranded trains module on the CDMT programme. We also produced onboard volunteer leaflets, which are carried by our train drivers. And if they need to put a call out on board for support for perhaps a driver-only evacuation, they can provide volunteers with what's required of them, a notebook and a pencil, so that we can report exactly into control what we're dealing with on that train. So have we got people with mobility impairments? Have we got people with visual impairments? Do we have babies? Do we have pushchairs? Do we have lots of luggage? Those are all the types of things that our onboard volunteers will be asked to consider and help feed that information into the control team so that we can make the best decisions in relation to deploying responders and prioritising. We've updated the stranded trains process and we've rewritten that using the RDG guidance and assessment tool. We have agreed a joint operational protocol with Network Rail Western, and Network Rail are going to roll that out nationally. And we have stranded train responder kits that are located at all of our hub stations. And that includes megaphones, water, foil blankets, and they can easily be moved around our network as required. In terms of people, we have an obligated on-call structure, but that wasn't enough. So we have now trained and developed a group of customer experience volunteers, mostly made up of HQ colleagues, and we are able to put out a call for help from them any time of day using a Teams channel, and they are directed as necessary by the customer experience controller within the route control centre. We have gone into more detail around our role-specific classroom training. So we have really spent a lot of time with external support, looking at our rail incident commander and our SIO and TOLO responders. So station incident officers, so there are station managers quite often, and our train operations liaison officers, who are often our driver managers and will go out and support the driver at an incident. We've developed additional training videos that are used both in new starter training and as refreshers. And we have stepped up a whole new post within the route control centre, which is the stranded trains champion. And they take the responsibility for deployment of resources and management of those stranded trains only, so that they are not then being distracted by having to manage other queries relating to the train service. They focus solely on the trains that have been stranded. And when I say stranded, by stranded, we mean stuck between stations. So they are on the running line and they're not stuck at a station. We refer to trapped trains in our process. If they are stuck at a station, they are trapped, not stranded. Next slide, please. So this is our customer experience plan for stranded trains. And as you can see at the bottom where it says train risks and facilities, this is where we've made it clear to all industry partners what risks the stock type carries, so that everybody has been trained and understood that before being involved in a live incident. We've said where the kits are, we've talked about onward travel, compensation, delay repay, how to raise a complaint. Everything is on one page, and all the Western operators are aligned to this. And we are now looking to roll this out onto the other side of our route, which is the Anglia side. And as you can see, we must agree a rescue plan within 30 minutes and complete the rescue within 90. But that means to be able to complete that rescue, that means that we have to have the right amount of responders on site. We have to have communicated to the people that are on those trains. We particularly need to focus on anybody who we're not going to be able to evacuate from those trains. So somebody with in a wheelchair or a mobility scooter, we need to make sure that we've made a backup plan for them and called on support as necessary. So for a large mobility scooter, we would be required to call London Fire Brigade to support us. So next slide, please. And this is just an example of our preparation for our volunteers and our on-call teams. So, you know, it can be very difficult when there are a lot of phone calls going off, when there is a lot of pressure, people are working under intense pressure and with adrenaline pumping around them. Having a step-by-step checklist will make sure that fundamental tasks that keep our customers and colleagues safe aren't forgotten. Next slide, please. But despite all of that, there are some considerable risks remaining across the industry. And I had some fun with ChatGPT, as you'll probably see in my picture there, because the ideal solution would be that we don't have these incidents. And if we do have them, we're able to deploy an additional emergency service to safely remove people quickly using jetpacks, drones, helicopters, but that's not realistic. So what we do need to consider as an industry, and not by TOC or by route, is resource. Right people, right time, right place. How can the National Operating Centre help us with that? Is there anything that we can do differently? Prolonged communication. You know, there are so many layers across the railway, and we rely on different communication tools. So we have different radios, different radio channels. We rely on Teams, we rely on WhatsApp, we rely on phone calls. How does aligning our communication strategy as an industry help us better respond to these safety incidents? Cross-industry testing and exercising opportunities are limited. You know, they take a lot of resource. They take a lot of planning. We run trains all of the time. You know, we have trains that run throughout the night. So how do we find the time and the opportunity to really focus and test our capacity to respond to these incidents? Infrastructure restrictions. So we've already talked about the fact that an incident at Paddington caused the overhead power lines to be switched off for a 24-mile section. When we are exploring new opportunities across the railway in terms of infrastructure, how do we ensure that those sections aren't so long, that people, when they are planning changes to the infrastructure, actually get so far down their planning that they can see how things will work from a customer perspective. Differing processes, interpretation of rules, and dynamic response across routes mean that different people respond in different ways. How do we standardise that? Onward travel provision. It's great if we can get people off trains safely and efficiently, but if we then leave them in a field or on a street corner with no onward travel provision, those customers are still stranded. They might be off the train, but they're not home, they're not at their end destination. And unfortunately, the provision for instant onward travel in terms of rail replacement buses, multiple taxis, it's not there. So how do we consider that into our plans? And then aggressive train service recovery plans that aren't customer focused. So, you know, we may be able to evacuate people safely and quickly. We may have onward travel provision for those that have been evacuated. But what about people that are left at stations? What about people who are still waiting 2 or 3 hours to get home because the operators are focusing on their stock and crew positions? So there's a lot there still to consider, still to resolve, and that I think is really worth the industry coming together and talking about frequently. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Claire. But before we get into some of the questions, there's a couple of, you know what we're like within the rail industry for our acronyms, our TLAs and FLAs, three-letter
Yes.
acronyms and four-letter acronyms. There was one around, could you clarify what you meant by TOLO, T-O-L-O?
TOLO. Oh, sorry, I
TOLO.
thought I had. So that's the Train Operations Liaison Officer.
Cool.
They're often driver team leaders or driver managers that go out to trains that are stranded or have been involved in an incident.
And also in this context, IET?
Oh, so that's a GWR. So I think they're intercity electric trains. They're fast, super fast intercity. That's how I know them.
Super, thank you. So what we'll do now, I'll refer to some of the questions that people have kindly posted throughout your presentation. So we've got a question from Neil McGrath, who has said, with bumping and ticket evasion being such an epidemic, how can an accurate number of customers stroke passengers be determined?
So we determine by weight on the train. So the train data picks up the weight of the train, and it's I think don't quote me on this, but I think our average calculation is 75 kilos per person is what it's calculated on. So it could be slightly more, could be slightly less.
Super, thank you. We've got a question from Keith Lyle. He says, based on previous and last week's events, does the issue merit some form of Network Rail talk media campaign? A focus on level crossing events, rightly similar info to the public would be a benefit. We on Railway know how soon Network Rail and Control will know. Public would benefit from that information. We know you were stranded. Don't leave the train on TV and other platforms. So what's your view on that, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would hurt. I joined the railway 14 years ago after being a civil servant in central London and commuting for quite a long time. And I used to be absolutely exasperated by not being able to get to work, not being able to get home. And obviously, I joined the railway and understand the complexities now. But yeah, as a layperson travelling, yes, some level of media campaign, but also I don't think we can fully rely on that. I think we have to make sure that we are focusing on those people on those trains and know who our travelling demographic are, make plans. Don't necessarily focus solely on stock and crew. I'm not saying that we do. There are some occasions where it feels that that's what's happening. So I think there is certainly something we can do in the media, but I think that there is something that we can do in terms of changing our thought process and perhaps not always focusing on the primary incident, so what's caused something, but really understanding how we're going to respond to this to the people that are stuck.
Thank you, Claire. That's good. Stephen Hollis has asked, how do you and passengers identify volunteers on the trains that have been briefed?
So we have an instruction to our drivers that asks them to put out a PA within 15 minutes onto their trains to ask for any off-duty emergency services or railway employees. We ask them to make themselves known at the front of the train in the driver's cab. We then provide them with, it's like a laminated envelope that contains a tick list around, as a volunteer, this is what we need you to do. We give them a quick briefing on going through, not doing a head count because we don't need it, because we know that we've got the information coming through from the train, but we don't necessarily know who's on that train in terms of physical impairments, visual impairments, babies, hidden disabilities, anybody that's wearing perhaps a sunflower lanyard that might need some support. They just might need some reassurance from a friendly face. It's very difficult for our drivers, because it is a driver only operation, to walk back through the train and be able to do that themselves, because they need to be in the cab to be able to communicate sufficiently with the signaller or the control team. So that's what we do. So we use those people to then report back into the driver, and the driver can then pass that information on into control.
And Ian Hollis, I think, we missed the it's disappeared. He's asked a related question regarding how many volunteers how many people are in your HQ customer experience volunteer cohort?
Well, quite a lot. I think there's about 80. However, and this was my point around right people, right place, right time. You know, it's great if you get a stranded train on a Wednesday at lunchtime, because there's lots of us that can go out and support. But if you're talking about the Friday before Christmas, when it's lots of people's Christmas parties and the weather's not so nice and people have travelled home, they're volunteers. So they're as good as what we've got at the time. And that is what is of huge concern to me.
Okay, thank you. Let me just pick another question. So Stephen Hollis again has asked, how many HQ staff are PTS trained to undergo evacuation training, or are these just for attending stations for aftercare, such as ongoing journey support?
That's right. So these are just for attending stations, or if they are, so you don't need PTS if you are accompanied by a RIO who can escort you to the train. So that's essentially what that cohort can do. So if we can safely get them to a train so they can do some onboard care, then we'll do that. But if we can't, they're there at stations.
Okay, thank you. So we've got another question from, no more from you, Stephen, I'm sorry. We've got one from Mike Joyce. It says, if you're relying on rail HQ volunteers who may have limited practical experience of the railway environment, is there a risk that these individuals may be put at risk? The line side environment is a dangerous place. They could also be exposed to aggression by irate passengers. How are these potential risks to volunteers mitigated? That's a good question.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I'll break that down into a couple. So anybody during a prolonged disruptive event, any railway colleague is at risk of workplace violence and aggression. And so we have actually so some of you on this call may know that on the Elizabeth line, we had a colleague that was killed in the workplace at Ilford on the 4th of December last year. And since then, we have uplifted our security and safeguarding officer team. We have also refreshed our de-escalation and conflict management training. And we have also set up a personal safety campaign in conjunction with British Transport Police, and also linked to the use of body-worn cameras. So that's called See It, Hear It, Film It. So we are very much focused, and our frontline teams are very focused on how to keep themselves safe during these incident types. In terms of the line side risk, with people perhaps not being operationally competent, we do not let them go line side unless they are with somebody that can escort them. We are only talking about getting people onto a train to provide customer service and water and foil blankets if necessary. So they would go with a RIO, or like I've mentioned during the presentation, we work actively with Network Rail to say, okay, who else do you have, such as P-Way, S&T, overhead line teams that can help get us onto these trains?
Thank you. There was I keep losing that. I'm finding an interesting question and keep losing it. So there was a question from Alex Clark. Has there been modelling simulations of evacuation of different train types, taking into account the different passenger types and human factors, e.g. elderly, young people, mobility issues, single narrow exits at one end of the train, etc.?
Yes. So not lots, because as I said during the last slide, it's really difficult to organise cross-industry evacuation sessions. So in terms of scenarios, so As quite a new railway, we're very lucky in that we had something called trial operations, and we had several opportunities to try out different types of evacuation on the Elizabeth line. And we continue to do things like that. So on Saturday night, we held Exercise Raptor, which was based around a hazardous chemical leak at a station and on board a train. And we had some volunteers available that we could evacuate. However, we didn't have people in mobility scooters. We didn't have people with visual impairment. We did have that during trial operations, but that was a few years ago now. But yes, very difficult to do.
That's a really nice lead on to a comment that we've got on the questions and answers from Delia Rush, who says, I recently took part in a multi-agency exercise at Cannon Street, London, which required passenger evacuation trackside. As a mobility scooter user, I was asked to play a passenger. Even though London Fire Brigade were there, they had trouble getting me off the train. In the end, they gave up. How do you know the Fire Brigade won't have to give up in future events you were talking about? That's really interesting to know.
Yeah,
Thank you, Delia.
And I don't know that actually, and so I think that's a really good point to raise. So we do an awful lot of work with our travel ambassadors. So people that we go out and we talk to around difficulties that they find travelling on the Elizabeth line. So I will actually take that back, and it's the head of customer experience, John Geary, that leads those sessions, and I will ask him to look into that in more detail, and also I'll let him know about your experience at Cannon Street. I honestly don't know how LFB and I don't know as well if it was because it was a planned exercise. So we had this on Saturday. Although it's a planned exercise, they don't always bring all of their available equipment with them. And so despite the fact that there was it was a hazardous chemical exercise on Saturday, they chose not to. And this was during the planning and it was all agreed, but they chose not to set up a HazChem shower. But in reality, they would have bought one and they would have set it up and they would have used it. So, I wasn't involved in the planning of the Cannon Street incident exercise. It may well have been known that they weren't going to come fully equipped, but I think it's very well worth looking into.
Yeah, thank you. Robert Knappman has asked an interesting question. How do we see this process progressing in the future with the GBR?
I'm hoping that some of the learnings that we have discovered since Ladbroke Grove, some of the changes that we have tried to make will actually be embraced by GBR for a more national conversation and potential rollout. We find it quite difficult being the Elizabeth line, where we run through three infrastructure managers. We have Network Rail Anglia, Network Rail Western, and Rail for London Infrastructure. And I think I touched upon it in some of my slides. There are different processes, different ways that some of those teams interpret rules and national operating procedures, different ways that people undertake dynamic risk assessment. So some use G-Force, some use other models. And I think that there is a potential as well with GBR to perhaps have a national volunteer list. So I live up near Peterborough. I previously worked for Network Rail in the Cambridge area, and there was quite a prolonged stranded train incident 6 weeks ago. And I was at home, didn't really have anything on a Saturday afternoon. If I had known, I would have gone out and deployed for support. So I think that there is certainly something as an industry, we quite often say we're the railway family, we're there to support each other. I have travelled as a commuter and dealt with multiple incidents for operators that don't employ me, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think that that's something that we need to look at through GBR to say, actually, how do we do this better?
And that leads me on to a really good question from Ed Hodson. As the author of a report into access to toilet facilities on Great British Railways, it referred specifically to concerns raised on turnaround times and potential issues on a lack of toilet facilities. This included MTR Elizabeth line.
Yeah.
So he is asking, has there been any consideration subsequently in respect of stranded trains?
In terms of when we have evacuated people to a location that doesn't have toilet facilities, or do you mean because of lack of toilet facilities on the train?
Maybe a bit of both. Because
I'll cover both.
Yeah.
So I think so on one of my slides on the customer experience plan, it shows that the 345 units, so the Elizabeth line train stock, that none of them have toilets, that they must be prioritised for evacuation or response over a train that perhaps has multiple toilets, multiple staff, and a buffet car. So that's pre-agreed. So whereas on the night of the Ladbroke Grove event, that wasn't pre-agreed. So we had a lot of response teams going to the primary incident train, and then we had other response teams going to other GWR trains. That would change because the stranded trains risk assessment will be weighed in the Elizabeth line stock favour because it's higher risk. In terms of being able to commit to provision of toilet facilities post-evacuation, that's where we have RAG rated the access points and can then better negotiate with Network Rail around where we will evacuate people to. Because it could be, for example, that there is an access point 50 metres in front of the stranded train that's red and is in the middle of nowhere, it's in a farmer's field, for example. But if we walked 75 metres to the rear, there's an amber or a green, which may have access to shops, accommodation, toilets, etc. And that's where we would say, well, actually, although the red one is closer, for an extra 20 metres, we'll take the one that's got the better facilities. So it's about making sure that we have that information at our fingertips so that when we are going into the huddles, the conversations with our industry partners during a live event, we know what we want and what's best for our customers. We can advocate for our customers.
Thank you, Claire. Keith Lyle has asked, can you see this leading to the old safe cess and all railway routes conversation coming back? You believe this is a benefit for all?
Yes, yeah, I can. I mean, I don't know how we would do it, but yes, I do think it should open up that conversation. And, you know, and again, up here where I live on the East Coast Main Line, you can drive down the side of the track. I remember going to an incident at Huntingdon and thinking, wow, this is incredible compared to some of the locations that I'd responded to incidents to previously. So yes, we should have that conversation. I'm not sure how likely it is to change, but we should have the conversation.
Okay. Tim Armour has asked, I think you mentioned that you have stranded train emergency packs at stations. Can you tell us what they might include? Do they have loud hailers, foil blankets? Are they also on the trains?
So they're not on the trains because anything you place onto a train, perhaps in a storage cupboard, requires quite a lot of engineering and safety justification, which I learned through this process. So what we have done is we've got kits that contain foil blankets, bottles of water, megaphones, notebooks, pencils, phone chargers.
I think someone has suggested fans. High-vis,
yeah, fans. I do think, I will double check, so I don't want to say we've definitely got fans, but I do remember John, who I've mentioned before, procuring fans. They might be in there, but for the purposes of this and because it's been recorded, I won't commit to it. But there is certainly all the other things in the stranded trains kit. But we are also putting those kits in our response cars. So we have 2 vehicles that are manned by land sheriffs, and they will also be able to take them to access points that we wouldn't be able to access from stations. So they've got those in their response vehicles.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Karen Hope has asked, for the large number of items that have been identified that need more to be done, and maybe across the industry, what is the proposal for how they should be tackled? And is there an active work stream looking at some of those, unresolved issues and things?
Yeah, there is. So like I said, it's really difficult as a train operator to influence nationally, but what we can do is work really closely with Network Rail system operator, and they have a whole directorate led by Phil Barnes, looking at keeping trains safely moving. And this all forms part of their work stream. So we feed in our learnings. We also pick up on other issues that we believe prolong stranded train events, and that could be resolved at a national level. So I think, a good example would be that we have been talking about recently trains that are stranded when there is a concern for welfare of an individual on a station, so somebody who may be in mental health crisis, and how sometimes being able to share better what's going on at a station location will mean that we can make better, safe use of trains moving at caution, rather than blocking the lines, having that one individual in crisis, but then potentially causing other medical or disorder crisis on board trains that are stranded. So we're continuing to talk, we're continuing to engage with them, but they really lead it on a national scale.
Okay. Mike Joyce asks, as someone who has had experience of train standing incidents, how are you planning to communicate more effectively with stranded passengers? I think we might have touched on this before. Communication is often poor or non-existent. Effective communication is key to keeping passengers calm.
Yeah, no, completely agree. So the setup of the stranded trains champion role, so there's one person in the control team that is focused solely on us as an operator stranded trains, so they don't do anything else. They don't worry about the train service and contingency plans. They only focus on communication with the drivers on those trains, deploying of resources, negotiating outcomes and plans, so whether or not we can move the train forwards, backwards, or whether or not we need to go for an evacuation, making sure that we've got the right people deployed quickly for an evacuation. So we would rather deploy people, stand up the stranded trains champion within 10 minutes, have everybody who needs to deploy within 15 minutes, and then stand them down if we need to. And you will see that quite frequently on our messaging, is that we stand up the stranded train champion, deploy people, and then we've stood them down 20 minutes later. But that slow creeping death with these incidents, because you're constantly hoping that by some miracle you'll be able to move that train, we don't fall for that anymore. And so we're constantly communicating with the drivers, but we also have the ability to communicate directly to the train. Now, there are some TU discussions going on around what types of instances, what's the process for communicating directly to a train, but we are actively working on that.
Okay. I think Stephen Hollis, I think he shares a similar viewpoint to you around cross-industry support and a call for volunteers from TOCs and FOCs who might be closer or trained in that can aid evacuation. And I think personally, a lot of the valid points and suggestions people have made, hopefully with the integration of track and train, and in the new world, there'll be things that are easier for us to achieve.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think, you know, we just need to be heard, and we do all need to come together. This is one of our highest risks on the railway. And so to be able to come together aligned is why really I want to take the opportunity to talk about this today, because the more people that are on board, the more people that are lobbying to work together as an industry, the more success we'll have.
And I think that's a good lead on to some of the comments as well about welfare, and working closely together in the future. And you know, welfare, stranded trains. Hopefully, we'll one of the benefits of the GBR will be that ability for us to work closer together. I think it's a good juncture there to give everyone a little bit of time back. Yeah, maybe grab lunch on the run and stuff. And I'd like to thank you, Claire, for taking the time to share your insights and your experiences with us.